At 4:30 in the morning, I was standing barefoot on cold kitchen tile, our 2-month-old son pressed against my chest, bacon grease in the air, a table set for 8 people, his people, and my husband walked through that door, looked at me like I was part of the furniture he was about to throw out, and said exactly one word. Divorce. Not "we need to talk." Not "I'm sorry." Not even my name. One word. Dropped into a kitchen that smelled like everything I had sacrificed, while I was literally holding the proof of every promise he had ever made me. I didn't scream. I didn't drop to my knees. I didn't even ask why. I turned off the stove, walked into the bedroom, and packed one suitcase. He was smirking when I walked out the door. He thought I was going to my mother's house to cry for a few days and come crawling back before his family finished breakfast. He thought he knew exactly who I was. He had forgotten who I was before I became his wife. And that mistake, that one arrogant, catastrophic mistake, was going to cost him everything he thought was his. My name is Remington. And this is the story of how a single word at 4:30 in the morning became the most expensive thing my husband ever said. I didn't come from money. I came from discipline. My mother raised me alone in a small rental house in Asheville, North Carolina, where the winters crept under the doors and the hot water ran out every other morning. She worked 2 jobs for most of my childhood. Early shifts at a hospital cafeteria, evening shifts answering phones for an insurance company, and she never once complained in front of me. What she gave me instead of comfort was clarity. Remington, she used to say while braiding my hair before school, a woman who understands numbers will never be powerless. I took that seriously. I studied accounting at the University of Tennessee on a partial scholarship, worked part-time at a tax prep office to cover the rest, graduated near the top of my class, and spent the next 6 years building a career as a corporate auditor. Not the kind of job people talk about at parties, but the kind of job that teaches you exactly how deeply people lie when money is involved, and more importantly, how to find proof of it. I was 31 when I met Evander Whitcomb at a corporate conference in Charlotte. He was in commercial real estate. Tall, well-dressed, the kind of man who filled a room without trying. He was charming in the effortless way that only becomes dangerous once you've already fallen for it. We dated for 2 years. He was attentive in the beginning. Flowers for no reason, weekend trips, long dinners where he actually listened. He met my mother. She smiled politely and said nothing critical, which, from her, I later understood was a warning. We got married in the fall. A quiet ceremony, just close family and a handful of friends, at a venue outside Knoxville. I wore a dress I had picked out alone because his mother, Marvella, had strong opinions about what the bride should look like at her son's wedding, and none of those opinions involved asking me. I should have paid closer attention to that detail. Marvella was the kind of woman who treated every room like a courtroom in which she was both judge and only credible witness. She had raised Evander to believe that a wife was a domestic arrangement, not a partner. That belief had simply transferred from her expectations into his behavior, and I hadn't seen it clearly until it was already woven into the fabric of our daily life. After the wedding, things shifted slowly, the way water damage works. Not all at once. Just a quiet, steady erosion. I had taken on a remote auditing role so I could be home more. A concession I made willingly at the time. Evander's career was expanding. There were dinner parties to host, his family visiting on long weekends, a house to maintain. I told myself it was temporary, that I would return to full capacity once things settled. Then I got pregnant. And the last version of balance I had been holding on to quietly disappeared. The pregnancy was hard. I was exhausted in a way I hadn't anticipated, the kind of exhaustion that sits behind your eyes and doesn't leave. Evander worked long hours. I understood that. What I didn't understand was when those long hours started coming with distance. Short answers. Evenings where he would come home, eat the dinner I had made, and disappear into his office until I was already asleep. I told myself it was stress, work pressure, the weight of providing. I was very good at finding reasons to believe the most comfortable story. Our son Callum was born 8 weeks before any of this happened. The birth was difficult. 31 hours, an emergency intervention I hadn't planned for, a recovery that left me moving carefully for weeks. Evander was present in the hospital. Polite. Distracted. He held Callum once before I was out of the recovery room. Once. And then the distance that had been building for months simply became the default setting of our home. I want to be clear about something. I did not miss what was happening because I was naive. I missed it because I was running on almost no sleep, recovering from a difficult birth, managing a newborn alone for most of each day, and still somehow keeping a household running for a man who had started treating me like a service he had subscribed to and forgotten to cancel. But I was also, and this is the part of myself I respect most, still paying attention. Not emotionally. Emotionally, I was doing what you do when you're 2 months postpartum and desperately hoping the distance is temporary. But professionally, in the quiet auditor part of my brain that never fully turned off, I had been noticing things. Small things. A transfer notification I hadn't been told about. An account name I didn't recognize. A late-night phone call where Evander stepped outside and came back with his jaw set in a way that had nothing to do with a work crisis. I didn't confront him. I documented. The transfers had been happening for 14 months. I had been actively documenting them for the last 8, since before Callum was born, building a record piece by piece while life continued around me as if nothing were wrong. Screenshots saved to a private cloud folder. Bank notification emails forwarded to an account Evander didn't know existed. Property records pulled from public filings. Dates, amounts, names. Not because I was certain. Because I was trained to follow the numbers. And the numbers had been whispering something I wasn't ready to hear out loud. By the morning of the 4:30 a.m., that folder held enough to tell a very complete story. Marvella and the rest of Evander's family were arriving at 8 o'clock that morning. His sister had texted me at 1:17 a.m., not a typo, actual 1:17 in the morning, to remind me that Marvella liked her eggs soft and her toast dry. No greeting. No apology for the hour. Just instructions, delivered like I was the household staff who needed to be briefed before a shift. I had been awake since midnight with Callum anyway, so I took the message, moved to the kitchen, and started preparing. That is the image I want you to hold. A woman 2 months out from a difficult birth, her newborn son against her chest, barefoot on cold tile in the dark, making breakfast for a family that had never once asked how she was doing. The front door opened at 4:30. I heard the key before I heard him. I had learned the rhythm of that sound, the way the lock always caught slightly on the second turn. A detail that becomes automatic when you live somewhere long enough. Evander came in with his tie loosened and his hair damp from the morning fog. He looked at the table. The folded napkins. The stacked plates. The stove. The warming bottle. The woman standing at the center of all of it, holding his son. He didn't say good morning. He didn't say anything that would suggest he registered that I was a person in that room. He said, divorce. That was the whole sentence. One word. Past tense in its delivery, like the decision had been completed somewhere else and he was simply announcing the result. For a moment, everything in the room became very sharp and very still. The hiss of the bacon. The hum of the refrigerator. Callum's small, steady breathing against my shirt. I did not ask who she was. I already had a name in a folder on a private drive, but that isn't even the point. The point is that when your husband walks in at 4:30 in the morning and says that word, the details of why don't actually change what the word means. They just give the wound a specific shape. And I was too tired, too clear-eyed, and too deliberate to spend whatever energy I had left demanding an explanation from a man who had clearly decided I wasn't worth one. So I reached over and turned off the stove. Evander blinked. I think he expected tears. Or shouting. Or both. Some reaction that would let him position himself as the calm, reasonable one and me as the unstable woman who couldn't handle the truth. I gave him nothing. Did you hear me? He asked. I heard you, I said. I walked past him into the bedroom. I pulled my old Navy suitcase from the top shelf of the closet, the one I had owned since before I knew his name, and I packed like someone taking a professional inventory. Diapers. Bottles. 3 sleepers for Callum. My laptop. My personal documents. Callum's hospital paperwork. The folder from behind the loose panel in the nightstand, the one Evander had no idea existed, which I transferred to my laptop bag without opening. My hands were steady the entire time. That scared me more than anything else. I expected them to shake. They didn't. And that stillness told me something about where I actually was inside, that some part of me, even at the most depleted moment of my life, understood what I was worth, and chose not to perform my pain for someone who had already decided my value. By 4:52, I was in the driveway. Callum was in his car seat. My suitcase was in the trunk. The porch light was on, and Evander was standing in the doorway in the yellow glow of it, phone in hand, watching me with the expression of a man who expected me to stop. "Where are you going?" he asked. I said. He gave a small, dismissive smile. "The kind that says you'll be back. The kind that belongs to men who confuse a woman's patience with a woman's inability to leave." I reversed out of the driveway without looking back. At 6:08 in the morning, I was sitting at the kitchen table of Vestia Calloway, a woman I had not seen in almost 2 years, but who I had called from the car at 5:15 with 3 words: "I need you." Vestia was a retired senior partner at one of Knoxville's most prominent financial litigation firms. She had been my mentor for 4 years early in my career, the woman who taught me that documentation wasn't just professional habit, it was the single most powerful tool a person could hold. She had survived 2 high-conflict legal disputes of her own before age 50. She had never once told me what to do with my marriage. But she had, once near the end of my maternity leave, said something offhand that I had never forgotten. "Keep your own records, Remington. Not because you expect to need them. Because you always should." Her kitchen smelled like peppermint tea and cedar. She didn't hug me when I walked in. She looked at Callum, looked at my face, and put the kettle on. "He said it while you were holding the baby," she said. "Not a question." "Yes." "And you packed and left. 1 suitcase." She sat across from me and folded her hands on the table. "Good. Let him think that's all you have." I placed my laptop bag on the chair beside me. "His family thinks I walked away with nothing," I said. "That's exactly what they should think," Vestia said, sliding a yellow legal pad across the table. "For now." We worked through the morning. Vestia called a forensic accountant she had worked with for 15 years, a methodical, precise woman who had untangled financial deceptions in cases far more complex than this one. I printed my documentation twice, once for Vestia, once for the file we would hand to an attorney. At 7:31, Marvella called. I let it ring. At 7:44, Evander's sister called. I let it ring. At 8:02, Evander called. I let it ring. At 8:17, a text came through. "My parents are here. Don't embarrass me." I read it twice. Then I set the phone face down and turned back to the account records spread across Vestia's kitchen table. The account Evander had opened 3 weeks before Callum was born. Not a business account, not a joint account, was the starting point. From there, the transfers told a story with a very clear beginning, middle, and trajectory. Across the 14-month period the accountant traced, just under $240,000 had moved through accounts structured specifically to obscure origin and destination. Some of it had gone toward a property I hadn't known existed. Some of it had been routed through a limited liability company, registered to a woman named Tawny Breslin. Tawny, the name I had found in a transfer record 7 weeks after Callum was born, at 2 in the morning, while Evander slept 6 feet away. I had sat with that name for 7 weeks. Added it to the folder. Kept moving. The forensic accountant confirmed what I had already understood. This wasn't impulsive. This wasn't a man who made a reckless decision in a moment of weakness. This was structured. Methodical. It had been built piece by piece over more than a year, while I was pregnant, while I was recovering, while I was standing barefoot in a cold kitchen making breakfast for people who thought I was the help. The attorney Vestia connected me with, a sharp, unhurried woman who specialized in high-asset marital cases, reviewed the documentation, and was quiet for a long moment before she spoke. This wasn't just a divorce anymore. It involved serious financial concealment, and that changed everything about how we needed to proceed. What followed was not fast. I want to be honest about that because I think there is a version of this story that makes justice look immediate, and that version would be a lie. What actually happened was deliberate, methodical, and because I had been deliberate and methodical from the start, extraordinarily effective. I did not return to the house. Vestia had a guest room, and for the first 2 weeks, that was where Callum and I lived. She was not sentimental about it, she was practical, which is the form of kindness I needed most. She brought tea in the mornings. She held Callum when I needed both hands to work. She said very little that wasn't useful. Evander texted with increasing frequency through those first days. The messages followed a pattern I had seen in the documentation, the same pattern his financial behavior followed. Confident first, then strategic. Then, when neither of those landed, slightly desperate. You left without any real plan. Think about what you're doing. The house is in both our names. You don't have standing to just disappear. I have an attorney. You should get one too if you're serious about this. I had already had one for 6 days by the time that last message arrived. The legal process, once it began moving, moved on the strength of the documentation. There were depositions. There was a formal forensic accounting report. There were records subpoenaed from financial institutions that confirmed, with complete precision, the structure of what Evander had built. The property he had purchased, a condominium registered to the LLC tied to Tawny Breslin, was identified and placed under review. The funds transferred through that LLC were traced. The timeline, which began 14 months before the morning of the 4:30 a.m., was reconstructed with the kind of clarity that left very little room for alternative interpretation. Marvella called me once during this period. It was the only time I picked up. She spoke for 2.5 minutes about family loyalty, about the sanctity of marriage, about how whatever problems her son and I had were private matters that should stay private. Her voice had that particular quality of a woman who has never been questioned in her own household and doesn't know what to do when the world stops cooperating. I let her finish. Then I said, Marvella, your son built a financial structure to conceal assets from a woman who was 8 months pregnant with his child. That is no longer a private matter. She was quiet for 3 seconds. Then she said, You won't win. I said, I already have everything I need. And I hung up. She wasn't entirely wrong that it wasn't going to be simple. Evander had resources and a legal team that clearly expected this to be a contest of attrition, that if they made the process expensive and prolonged enough, I would eventually accept a settlement that favored him. What they had not accounted for was that I had 8 months of documentation, a forensic accountant whose report was airtight, and an attorney who had been doing this for 22 years and genuinely enjoyed the cases where the other side was overconfident. The settlement negotiation lasted 11 weeks. In the end, Evander did not get to define what I walked away with. The concealed assets were factored into the marital estate. The property tied to the LLC was included in the accounting. Between the primary residence, the liquid assets, and the recaptured funds, I came out of that marriage with a financial foundation that, combined with my own professional qualifications, which had never actually gone anywhere, gave me and Callum a starting point that Evander had specifically designed to prevent me from having. The final settlement also required him to cover my legal fees, a detail the attorney had pushed for, and one I hadn't taken for granted until the ink was dry. I heard, through a mutual contact, that Marvella told people I had been calculating from the start, that I had gone into the marriage with a plan to extract money from her son. I want to address that directly for anyone who has ever had something similar said about them. I went into that marriage in good faith. I made concessions I shouldn't have made. I tolerated things I should have named sooner. The documentation I kept was not a plan. It was a professional habit and a quiet survival instinct in a woman who had been trained to pay attention to numbers. The only person who came into that relationship with a hidden financial structure was Evander. 10 months after the morning of the 4:30 a.m., I signed a lease on a 2-bedroom apartment in Asheville, the same city where my mother had raised me, where the winters crept under the doors and the hot water sometimes ran out. But this apartment had good windows, a view of the mountains, and a second bedroom where Callum slept in a crib I had assembled myself on a Tuesday evening while he watched from a bouncy seat and made the specific face he makes when he finds something puzzling. I cried that night. Sitting on the floor of his room, back against the crib instructions in my lap, I cried for probably 30 minutes. Not from grief. Not for Evander. I cried because I was tired, and because my son was 2 months old the morning everything collapsed, and because it had taken everything I had to hold steady while the ground fell away, and the ground had finally stopped falling. I called my mother. She picked up on the second ring, the way she always does, as if she has been quietly expecting the call. I told her I had signed the lease. That Callum and I were okay. That I had come through it. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I know you have. You were always going to. I returned to work 4 months after the settlement. Full-time, the role I had been keeping at low capacity through everything. Within the first year, I had taken on 2 new clients and been asked to lead an internal review for a regional firm that later resulted in a long-term contract. Callum had started sleeping through the night around 5 months old, back when the legal process was still in full motion and that small, reliable quiet felt like something I hadn't yet earned. By 10 months, he was pulling himself up on the crib rails and looking at me like he already had opinions about things. He has my mother's eyes, dark and steady, the kind that seem to be thinking even before the words arrive. I think about the version of myself who stood in that kitchen at 4:30 in the morning sometimes. Barefoot. Exhausted. Holding a 2-month-old. Making breakfast for people who thought they had already won. What I want to say to her, what I want to say to anyone standing in a version of that kitchen right now, is this: your silence is not weakness. Your documentation is not coldness. Your decision to leave without crying in front of him is not a sign that you didn't love him or that you weren't devastated. It is a sign that some part of you, even at the most depleted moment of your life, understood what you were worth and chose not to perform your pain for someone who had already decided your value. The most powerful thing I ever did was pack that suitcase steadily. Not dramatically. Not with a speech. Just steadily. And then I drove away in the dark, and I let him stand in the porch light thinking I had nothing. He was wrong. He had always been wrong about that. Evander expected my silence to mean surrender. He found out it meant something else entirely. If you're watching this right now, if you're sitting in a version of that kitchen, exhausted and underestimated, wondering whether the quiet, careful choice is worth making, I just want to ask you one thing. What would you do if the person who thought you had nothing finally found out exactly what you'd been building all along? Leave your answer below. I read every single one.